I'd always been a skeptic when it came to things like Bigfoot. I wasn't one to get swept up in stories or legends. I had a solid, grounded view of the world, shaped by years of working in law enforcement and a relentless demand for evidence before belief. But when my old friend Alex reached out to me with that familiar gleam in his eye, something changed. Alex had always been the adventurous type, bold, wild, and obsessed with the mysteries of the world. It had been years since we'd seen each other, but his invitation to join him on a Bigfoot expedition in the Cascades, of all places, was something I couldn't resist. Alex had always been a bit of a conspiracy theorist, and his latest obsession was finding proof of the elusive creature that had captivated the world's imagination for decades. He'd spent countless nights researching, reading, and studying every obscure account of sightings, every strange occurrence, until it consumed him. And now he was headed to the thick forests of Washington, armed with cameras, recording equipment, and a reckless enthusiasm that seemed to have replaced his usual rationality. I had my doubts. I really did, but part of me was intrigued. I hadn't seen Alex in so long, and maybe, just maybe, this could be the adventure we used to dream about. So, without much thought, I packed my bags, grabbed some gear, and met him at the base of the Cascades. The air was fresh, but it had an odd chill to it, one that didn't belong to the crisp, clean mountain air I was used to. Alex was already there, pacing around with a buzz of excitement that was contagious. We exchanged pleasantries and quickly began our trek into the dense woods. The moment we entered the forest, something in the air changed. The trees loomed tall and thick, their branches twisted and gnarled like the fingers of forgotten ghosts. The path quickly disappeared underfoot, swallowed up by the wilderness. Alex was relentless, forging ahead as if the forest itself couldn't stand in his way. The first day passed without much incident. The usual sounds of the forest surrounding us, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot. But as the hours ticked by, I began to notice things. Small things. The way the silence would fall too suddenly. The way a shadow in the corner of my eye would shift too quickly to be anything natural. I dismissed it at first, telling myself it was the product of my imagination. But as we moved deeper into the forest, I could feel something. Something was off. It wasn't until the late afternoon that we came across something we couldn't ignore. Large footprints, imprinted deeply into the soft earth. They were far too large to belong to any animal I knew of, bigger than bear tracks, wider than anything I'd seen in the wild. At first, I thought it might have been some prank, maybe a bear or elk that had wandered too close to a human camp and left a trail of half-formed prints. But the more I examined them, the more I realized they weren't normal. They had a strange shape, a depth to them that felt unnatural, as if something much larger and heavier had passed through. Alex's eyes lit up when he saw them. "This is it," he said, almost whispering, like he didn't want to disturb the forest itself. "This is what I've been looking for." I wasn't so sure, but my skepticism began to shift, ever so slightly. We followed the trail, our steps tentative but driven by an undeniable curiosity. The further we went, the more questions popped into my head. Could it be a bear? An unknown species of wildlife? Or was it something more? Maybe Alex was right. Maybe there was something out there in the Cascades that hadn't been seen by modern eyes. As dusk fell, the air grew colder. We made camp near a small clearing, setting up our tents and preparing a fire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound breaking the silence, but that silence didn't last. As the light from our campfire flickered and danced, a low, guttural sound echoed through the trees, distant but unmistakable. It wasn't the sound of a bear or a mountain lion. It was something different. It was too deep, too powerful, like it came from the very earth itself. At first, I thought it might have been my imagination, but when I looked over at Alex, his face was pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, excitement, maybe both. He leaned in close, his voice barely a whisper. "That's it. That's the call." The call? I had no idea what he was talking about, But whatever it was, it had definitely gotten my attention. The sound reverberated through the forest again, longer this time, and even deeper. It sounded almost human, but not quite. The way the pitch fluctuated, rising and falling in eerie waves, sent a chill straight to my spine. It felt like the forest was alive, like it had its own heartbeat, and it was echoing this strange, primal sound in response to our intrusion. I tried to shake it off. Probably just an animal, I said, but even I could hear the doubt in my own voice. No, Alex insisted, his eyes burning with a strange intensity. That's a Bigfoot call. It's real. I'm telling you, we're on the right path. Against my better judgment, I agreed to go after it. Maybe it was the way Alex spoke with such conviction, or maybe it was the lure of something bigger than myself, something ancient and undiscovered. I grabbed my flashlight, and we ventured into the woods. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine, the kind of smell that sticks to your skin and gets into your lungs. The further we walked, the quieter the forest became. The wind had died down completely, and even the rustle of leaves seemed to vanish. We moved through the trees, our lights casting long shadows that twisted unnaturally across the ground. The call came again, but this time it was closer, much closer. I froze. It wasn't just the sound that got to me, it was the way the air shifted, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. We kept moving, following the noise, but the deeper we went, the more disorienting it became. The calls were erratic now, shifting in tone, almost as if it were responding to us. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, my breath shallow and quick. And then we saw it. It wasn't just a shadow or a trick of the light. There, in the clearing ahead, a hulking figure stood motionless in the trees. Its shape was massive, its proportions wrong in a way that made my stomach churn. It wasn't like anything I had ever seen. Too large to be human, too fast and graceful to be an animal. The figure was covered in dark fur, its body rippling with muscle, and its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. For a moment, I was paralyzed, frozen in place, unsure if what I was seeing was real. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching us. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't fear, at least not at first. It was something deeper, something primal, like being stared at by the forest itself. Something about its presence was ancient, as if it had been here long before us and would remain long after we were gone. Alex was the first to speak, but his voice was thick with awe. It's real. It's here. We've found it. I didn't reply, couldn't. My mouth had gone dry, my body rigid. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but my legs wouldn't obey. For a long, agonizing moment, we simply stared at each other, the creature and I, locked in some kind of silent understanding. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and vanished into the trees, moving silently, effortlessly, as if it had never been there at all. Alex wanted to go after it. He was determined to track it, to follow it deeper into the forest. But something inside me, something primal, told me that we had just crossed a line we couldn't uncross. I didn't argue with him. I didn't say a word. We simply returned to camp, both of us shaken in ways we didn't yet understand. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The fire flickered and crackled, but the world outside the circle of light felt wrong. I could feel eyes on me, watching me, from the shadows of the trees. I lay awake, my mind racing with what we had just seen, what we had just experienced. The forest was full of things I wasn't ready to understand. The second night, though, would bring answers, or perhaps more questions. Couldn't sleep that night. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that kept me company as I lay on my back in the dark, staring up at the canopy of trees above me. The world felt foreign. The familiar rustling of the forest had gone quiet, and the air was thick with something I couldn't quite name, something unnatural. Even though Alex had reassured me that it was just the wilderness playing tricks on us, I knew better. There was something in those trees, something that hadn't been there before, or maybe something I had never noticed. Something watching. The memory of that hulking figure kept replaying in my mind, those glowing eyes that locked onto mine, and the way it vanished without a sound, like a shadow slipping away into the depths of the forest. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the shadows had played tricks on me, or maybe I had seen something, a bear or a tree stump or something equally mundane. But deep down, I knew the truth. What we had seen wasn't anything I had ever encountered before, and that thought filled me with dread I couldn't shake off. The worst part wasn't the sight of the creature itself, but the way it made me feel. There was no fear in those eyes, no aggression, just an unblinking, ancient awareness. It wasn't hunting us. It wasn't chasing us. It was simply watching, waiting, and that, more than anything, made my skin crawl. Alex had been different after the encounter. His excitement had grown, his every word filled with a sense of urgency. He had insisted we go after it again to find more evidence, to track it deeper into the woods. And I had agreed, but my stomach twisted at the thought of returning. The rational part of my mind told me that it was just some animal, a bear or a large, undiscovered species of ape. It was easy to dismiss the fear, but the unease still lingered in the back of my mind. A dark little whisper that told me there was something more, something that had no place being in those woods. That night, we didn't talk much. I couldn't find the words to explain what I was feeling, and Alex seemed to be lost in his own excitement. As we settled into our tents, I lay there for what felt like hours, listening to the silence that stretched beyond the firelight. Even the usual sounds of wildlife seemed muted. The wind had died down completely, and the only thing that moved was the occasional shifting of branches under the weight of something unseen. When I finally managed to fall asleep, I dreamed of those eyes again. They were always watching, unblinking, relentless. But this time, there was no figure to accompany them. Just the emptiness of the forest, the same sense of being surrounded by something unseen but ever-present. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It wasn't morning yet. The sky was still a dark shade of blue, the kind that promised rain. I sat up in my tent, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. The quiet had taken on a weight I couldn't bear. Alex was already up, packing his gear with a kind of feverish intensity. His movements were sharp, calculated, like he was in a rush. He didn't look up when I emerged from my tent, his eyes fixed on the ground as he worked. It wasn't until I spoke that he acknowledged me. "We need to go back," I said, my voice low but firm. I didn't want to sound like I was backing out, but the thought of returning to that forest, the thought of tracking whatever it was, felt like something I couldn't shake. Alex looked up at me, his eyes gleaming. "You're not backing out on me now, are you?" There was no hint of hesitation in his voice, only determination. He was consumed with this, obsessed with proving it. "I'm serious," I said. "Last night, I don't know, man. Something's not right. We've seen enough for one trip. Let's just go home." For a moment, Alex didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his face unreadable. And then, without a word, he turned back to his pack and zipped it closed. I knew then that there was no convincing him. I had made up my mind, but Alex had already made his. "We're not leaving without more proof," he muttered, almost to himself, before turning and heading for the edge of the clearing. "We're going back in." The dread that had been lingering at the edges of my mind settled into my gut, like a stone I couldn't dislodge. But what could I do? I had come with him, and despite my unease, I wasn't going to leave him out here alone. Not after what we'd seen. So I followed, each step heavier than the last. The forest seemed different in the daylight. During the day, the woods were just trees, and the air smelled of pine and earth. But now there was something more to it. The trees seemed closer, their branches twisting in on themselves, their trunks rising like silent sentinels. The further we went, the more oppressive the air became. The sounds that had once been comforting, the calls of birds, The rustling of animals in the underbrush had faded away, replaced by a suffocating silence. We walked for hours, the dense undergrowth making each step difficult. The trail we had followed yesterday had disappeared entirely, and we were left with nothing but the vague direction we'd set the night before. The further we ventured, the more out of place everything felt. The quiet was unnatural, like the entire forest had become a graveyard. At one point, we stopped to rest, the weight of the silence pressing in on us. Alex had been grinning this whole time, but now that smile had faded. His eyes darted nervously around the clearing. I noticed it then, the same unease I had been feeling. It was there in his movements, his posture. He wasn't as certain as he had been. "I don't like this," I said, breaking the silence. "I think we should turn back." Alex turned sharply toward me, his face hard. "No, we're going deeper." His voice wasn't the same as before. It had an edge to it now, something darker. He was determined, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in him. Maybe it was the forest, or maybe it was the thing we'd seen last night. But whatever it was, it had taken hold of him in a way I didn't understand. We didn't turn back. The sun began to set as we pushed deeper into the forest, our footsteps growing more cautious. Every sound, every rustle in the trees, seemed amplified in the eerie quiet that had enveloped us. It was as if the world had stopped breathing. The forest had become something else, something alive, something aware of our presence. I don't know how much further we walked, but eventually we reached a clearing, a place that felt wrong the moment we stepped into it. The air was colder here, the trees twisted into strange shapes, like they had been shaped by something unnatural. There was no wildlife here, no birds or animals, nothing, just us. And then, from somewhere deep within the forest, we heard it. The call. It came again, deep and guttural, echoing through the trees. This time, it wasn't distant. It was close, too close. Before I could say anything, Alex was already moving. His face lit up with that maddening excitement. He was grinning, wide and manic. "It's here," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "It's right here." I wanted to scream at him to stop, to turn around, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. The further we went, the more I felt it. Something watching us, something moving just beyond the reach of our lights. Shadows shifted in the corners of my vision, always just out of sight. And then, as we rounded a bend, I saw it again. The figure, larger than before, looming between the trees, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. And this time, it wasn't standing still. It was moving toward us. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And I knew, without a doubt, that we weren't alone anymore. I shouldn't have gone back. I should have listened to that gut feeling, the one that gnawed at me when I stood at the edge of the woods that second night. My heart had told me to run, to turn around, to forget about the thing we had seen, to forget about Alex's obsession. But I didn't, and now I was paying the price. The moment we saw it again, that hulking figure emerging from the trees, the world felt smaller, like the forest was closing in on us. The air had thickened, pressing down on me in a way that was hard to describe. It wasn't the oppressive silence of the forest, or the weight of the shadows hanging over us, though that was bad enough. No, it was something more, something ancient and primal, as though the very earth itself was holding its breath. I remember the way my body froze as soon as it stepped into the clearing. The creature, if that's what it even was unlike anything I had ever seen. The first time we'd encountered it, it had been distant, shrouded in shadow, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding trees. But now it was closer, so close that I could see the details I had missed before. The size was overwhelming, at least 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, matted fur, the color of wet earth, and its limbs were long, impossibly long, with the kind of muscle you only saw in creatures designed for strength. But it wasn't just the sheer scale of it that terrified me. It was its presence, its stillness. It didn't move toward us with aggression or curiosity, but with something colder, an awareness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I've heard people talk about feeling watched, but I'd never known what that really meant until that moment. It wasn't just the creature watching us. It was the forest, too. Everything was watching us. I could see the way the moonlight caught its eyes, glowing faintly through the darkness. They were human-like, but not quite. There was an intelligence in them, a kind of deep, ancient knowledge. And then, in the silence that followed, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a tremor in the air, a vibration that made my teeth ache. But then it grew like a pressure building, a soundless roar that I could feel in my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. I wanted to speak, to ask Alex what the hell we were supposed to do, but the words wouldn't come. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. There was nothing but the sound of my pulse hammering in my ears and the crackling of our campfire. But that fire, it was starting to feel small, pitiful even. We were standing at the edge of something much older, something that didn't care about our fire, our cameras, or our plans. Whatever it wasn't afraid of us. It wasn't afraid of anything. And then it moved. Not quickly, not with any rush or urgency, but with a deliberate slowness that made every step feel like it was stretching out forever. Its footfalls were silent, but they left an impression in the earth that I could see even from where I stood. It wasn't trying to sneak up on us. It wasn't hunting us. It was simply walking, like it had all the time in the world. In that moment, I didn't know what terrified me more, the creature or the realization that we were nothing but an inconvenience to it. We weren't threats. We weren't anything. We were intruders, and it was letting us know. I felt Alex move beside me, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I glanced over at him. His face was pale, eyes wide. He was staring at the creature with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I couldn't tell if he was terrified or if he was in awe, but there was something in his eyes that made me uneasy. "This is it," he whispered, voice tight with something I couldn't place. "We've found it. This is the proof. This is real." I wanted to shake him, to make him see reason, but my body refused to cooperate. I couldn't stop staring at it, at the thing that was so far beyond anything I could explain. And then, in a split second, it looked directly at us. The air seemed to freeze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest like a drumbeat, louder than anything in that moment. Those eyes, they weren't just looking at us. They were looking through us. And I swear, for a split second, I felt a kind of understanding pass between us. Something that told me that whatever this thing was, it knew we weren't a threat. We were just ants beneath its feet. We were nothing. And then it was gone, just like that. 1 second, it was there, a hulking figure standing in the clearing. The next, it melted into the shadows, as though it had never existed at all. It didn't run, didn't charge off into the trees. Simply vanished. I don't know how long we stood there after that. I couldn't bring myself to move, to look away. My legs were like jelly, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. I felt like I had stepped into another world, one where the rules of reality didn't apply, and nothing made sense anymore. I finally turned to Alex. His face was still fixed in that same wide-eyed stare, his mouth moving, but no words came out. He was muttering something under his breath, something incoherent, as if trying to make sense of the impossible. But he wasn't scared. He wasn't worried. He was thrilled. "I knew it," he said, almost to himself. "I knew it was real. This is it. This is the proof we need. We found it." His words were like a mantra, repeating over and over in a voice that seemed too loud for the quiet of the forest. He turned to me then, his eyes bright, his expression full of that same frantic energy I had seen in him earlier. "We have to follow it. We have to track it down. This is our chance." But something inside me snapped. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't follow him into that darkness. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on me, the shadows creeping closer, closing in around us. The air was thick with something I couldn't explain, something that felt wrong, like we had stirred something up that we couldn't control. "Alex," I said, my voice cracking as I grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Now." But he shrugged me off, the manic gleam in his eyes only intensifying. No, we're not leaving. We're not done here. We're so close. I wanted to scream to force him to understand, but I couldn't. I was terrified of the creature of the forest and of what Alex had become. He wasn't the same person I had come out here with. The hunger in his eyes had replaced the curiosity I had once seen in him. This wasn't about discovery anymore. It was about obsession. Without another word, I turned away, stumbling backward, my legs still weak beneath me. I knew I was leaving him behind, and maybe that was the only thing I could do. I don't remember how far I ran, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I felt something chasing me, not physically, but in the very air around me. It was like the forest itself was reaching out, dragging me back toward the clearing, toward the thing that had watched us. I don't know how I made it back to camp. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was just sheer panic. But I found myself there, back by the fire, the flame flickering weakly in the growing darkness. The world around me felt unreal, distorted, like I had woken up from some terrible nightmare. And then the silence came again. I sat there, unable to move, unable to breathe, knowing that I wasn't alone, that the forest wasn't done with me yet, and I wasn't sure if I would make it out alive. Not with Alex still out there, not with whatever it was still watching. I sat by the fire for what felt like hours, staring into the dancing flames, my mind a whirlpool of dread and disbelief. Every creak of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush made my heart leap into my throat. The fire, once a comforting beacon, now felt like a fragile shield against the darkness closing in around me. I couldn't bring myself to leave it, couldn't force my legs to move, even though I knew deep down that I should. The night stretched on, empty and oppressive. The sounds of the forest seemed to have disappeared altogether, as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. I tried to convince myself that Alex was fine, that he had just gone deeper into the forest to investigate further. But the rational part of my brain, the one still screaming at me to leave, knew better. He wouldn't just leave me like that, not without a word, not without a sign. He was still out there, and whatever it was that had taken hold of him, it wasn't letting go. I forced myself to stand, my knees trembling as I glanced around the camp. The shadows seemed to stretch longer now, like they were crawling across the forest floor, inching toward me. I wanted to call out to Alex, to tell him we needed to go, but the words stuck in my throat. The silence was suffocating, as though the forest itself had decided to swallow us whole. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I wasn't alone. I slowly turned toward the edge of the clearing, my breath caught in my chest. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a shadow, a shape, just beyond the reach of the firelight. It was too large to be an animal, too still to be a person. My heart slammed against my ribcage as I stared at it, paralyzed. And then the shape moved. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I could recognize. The creature that stepped into the light wasn't the same as the one I had seen before. This one was larger, broader, more monstrous. Its fur was thicker, darker, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace that sent a wave of nausea through me. Its eyes locked onto mine, glowing faintly in the night, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was the same feeling as before, an overwhelming awareness, an intelligence that felt ancient, beyond anything I could comprehend. I took a step back, and then another, my legs shaking beneath me. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. The air was thick with its presence, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey, rooted to the spot by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. I didn't wait for it to come back. I didn't wait for anything. I ran. My breath was ragged, my mind too full of terror to form a single coherent thought. I stumbled through the underbrush, crashing through the trees, not caring about the branches that scraped at my face or the roots that tripped me up. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to close in around me. It was like the trees themselves were pushing me back, forcing me toward something I couldn't outrun. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, and I could feel my legs weakening, my energy draining. I didn't know where I was going anymore. I didn't know if I was even headed in the right direction. Then I heard it, the call, that same deep, guttural sound that had haunted me since the night before. It echoed through the trees, vibrating in my bones, and I knew then that I wasn't alone. It wasn't just in the distance this time. It was close, too close. I stumbled forward, heart pounding in my chest, and I saw it, Alex's flashlight, flickering in the distance, the beam cutting through the darkness. Relief surged through me at the sight of it, but it was quickly replaced by a cold dread. Something wasn't right. The light was moving erratically, as if something was holding it, but not using it properly. It swung wildly through the trees, and then I heard Alex's voice, faint but frantic. "Help! Help me!" I broke into a run again, my legs screaming in protest, the panic driving me forward. I couldn't lose him, not like this. But when I finally broke through the last line of trees into the small clearing where the light had been, the scene that greeted me stopped me dead in my tracks. Alex was there, but he wasn't Alex, not anymore. His body was slumped against a tree, his clothes torn and dirty. His face was pale, streaked with dirt and blood. But it wasn't the physical state of him that made my stomach churn. It was the look in his eyes. His eyes were wide open, staring into nothing, filled with a kind of terror I had never seen before. His mouth hung open, and his body trembled as though it was still alive, still functioning, but there was nothing left inside him. The spark, the life, the Alex I had known, it was gone. I took a hesitant step toward him, and then I saw it, the mark on his neck. There was something there, something dark and bruised, like fingers had wrapped around him. But it wasn't just bruising. It was something else, something deeper, something unnatural. The mark was burned. The edges of the wound were jagged, as though something had clawed its way into him from the inside. I stepped back, my stomach turning. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but there was no one left. The forest was silent again. There were no footsteps, no calls, no sounds at all. Just me and the remnants of what had once been my friend. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I spun around, panic surging through me as the shadows at the edge of the clearing seemed to writhe, pulling together, coalescing into something large, something monstrous. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran again, not caring where I was going, only that I had to get away. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in tighter and tighter around me, as though the very earth itself was rising to meet me. The last thing I remember was the ground giving way beneath my feet, the world spinning into darkness, and the feeling of something massive, something ancient, reaching out to claim me. I woke up in my own bed, back in the city, the morning sunlight streaming through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. I thought for a moment that it had all been a dream, that the creature, the woods, Alex's body, it was all just a nightmare. But when I reached for my phone and saw the messages from his family, the missing posters, the search team still combing the forest, I knew the truth. Alex was gone, and whatever we had seen in those woods was still out there.